Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your sources, peel back the layers of complexity, and deliver the concentrated knowledge you need to grasp the bigger picture.
And today, we are taking a monumental journey, both in space and, well, in time.
We're heading far south along the Nile, way past the familiar territory of the Egyptian dynasties, into a region that for too long has been sort of pushed to the sidelines of ancient history.
Absolutely. We're talking about the vast, complex, and powerful world of modern Sudan, which archaeologically we know as Nubia and the Middle Nile Basin.
That's a really critical starting point. Our deep dive today is focused on unpacking a powerful synthesis of this history, drawing mainly on David N. Edwards' essential work, The Nubian Past.
And our goal is nothing less than a complete reorientation. We want to move deliberately, decisively beyond those traditional Egyptocentric narratives.
The ones that just saw this area as a buffer zone for Egypt, or a place to get resources.
Exactly, just a quarry for its northern neighbor. We're going to move past that.
So we are talking about revealing the deep, autonomous history of this region. We're going to examine some startling technological achievements. Things like the invention of pottery thousands of years before farming even started. And we'll trace the sheer complexity of these early African civilizations that flourished south of the First Cataract. This is where, truly unique states began to form.
Our core promise to you, the listener, is that by the end of this deep dive, you will have a completely revised understanding of what ancient civilization even looks like outside that Mediterranean model.
Right.
We're going to uncover a model of societal development that often inverted the traditional Neolithic checklist.
Yeah.
And we will reveal how this region produced Kush, one of the most spectacular, technologically advanced, and militarily powerful kingdoms of the Bronze Age.
A kingdom that, for a time, genuinely held the fate of Egypt in its hands.
It really did.
Okay, let's unpack this monumental geographical scope first, because when most people hear Nubia, they think of the area immediately south of Aswan.
Right, where the great temples had to be moved for the dam.
Exactly, that very narrow stretch of river.
And that traditional, limited definition of Nubia is precisely what Edwards and really all contemporary Africanist scholars are pushing against.
So that old definition is too small.
Way too small. Historically, Nubia was often restricted to that riverine North Lower Nubia, the neighbor closest to Egypt. But if we want to understand the origins of power and complexity, we have to look wider, much wider.
So we're expanding our map to include the entire Sudan. What does that truly encompass? I mean, what's the scale we're talking about?
We're talking about the Middle Nile Basin and Eastern Sudanic Africa. And you have to put this into perspective. This is a truly colossal geographical space. Over 2.5 million square kilometers.
Wow.
Just to give you a reference point, that area is larger than all of Western Europe combined.
Okay, that is huge.
And for millennia, this massive region served as a critical nexus, the dynamic meeting point where the Eurasian worlds, following the Nile and the Red Sea trade routes, intersected with the vast sub-Saharan worlds coming up from the Central African interior and the Sahel.
So it's a crossroads, not a dead end. And what's fascinating here is the author's clear intent to formally relocate these early civilizations within their broader Sudanic African context. Why is that so important for, the study of history?
It's crucial because historically studies of this region, particularly those focusing on the Nile Valley, they tended to look only north, only towards Egypt.
Right.
And as a result, this research often remained completely isolated from other Africanist studies happening further west in the Sahel or West Africa or the Ethiopian highlands. By placing the Middle Nile within its Sudanic context, we start to see shared cultural, technological, and demographic trends that span thousands of kilometers.
Instead of just seeing it as some kind of weird anomaly created by Egyptian influence.
Exactly. You get the bigger picture.
This brings us immediately to what you called the elephant in the room, the problem of Egyptocentrism. This is more than just a preference for Egyptian history. It seems like it fundamentally warped the archaeological interpretation of everything to the south.
It absolutely did. I mean, archaeology in the region was dominated by Egyptological traditions, particularly since the 19th century. Key figures like Lepsius and, maybe most influentially, George Reisner. He was an American archaeologist working for Harvard. He really set the foundational framework.
And Reisner was the one who excavated some of the most spectacular sites, right? Kerma, Meroe.
He did. His fieldwork was incredible. But his interpretive framework was, well, he was incredibly biased.
How so?
Well, he famously wrote in 1910 that Nubian history was, and I'm quoting here, hardly more than an account of its use or neglect by Egypt.
Wow, okay.
And that set a prevailing assumption for decades. If Nubia was thriving, it was because Egypt was strong in employing them. If it was weak, it was because Egypt had abandoned them. This framework just grasped. It completely dismissed the possibility of autonomous, internally driven development.
And contemporary archaeology is challenging that by, it seems, literally changing where we look.
Absolutely. Scholars like W.I. Adams and Edwards himself argue very convincingly that Lower Nubia, the area closest to Egypt, which got the lion's share of early excavation, was, ironically, often peripheral.
The borderland.
Exactly. It was a marchland. Sometimes it was occupied by small trading polities or Egyptian forts, but the truly richer, more densely populated regions, the genuine centers of indigenous power, wealth, and monumental construction, they were located much, much further south.
So we need to shift our mental map away from the borderlands and toward the heartland, deep in what is now Sudan. And this shift southward wasn't just a political choice, was it? It was tied directly to long-term environmental change, almost a catastrophe.
That's the critical millennia-spanning driver. This region was not always the arid landscape we imagine today. In the early Holocene, it was a relatively open world of savanna woodlands and grasslands.
A green Sahara.
The Green Sahara, exactly. But increasing aridity, driven by climate change, specifically the southward retreat of the seasonal rainfall belts, gradually fragmented that world. This climactic pressure didn't just cause desertification, it dictated political movements. It pushed the centers of population and political focus progressively southward over vast stretches of time.
And we can actually trace this political migration chronologically, almost like a slow-motion retreat toward the central water source.
Precisely. The first great indigenous kingdom, the Bronze Age center of Kerma, it flourished in the Dongola Reach. That's about 300 kilometers south of the Second Cataract.
Okay.
Later, around the mid-1st millennium BC, the heart of the powerful Meroe kingdom shifted even further south to the Shendi Reach. And by the 17th century AD, the final great indigenous polity, the Funj Sultanate, was centered even further south along the Blue Nile, at Sinnar.
That's a political timeline stretching 4,000 years, all driven by the water table and where you could graze your animals.
It fundamentally blurs the modern, rigid dichotomy often assumed between an Arab North and an African South. This history shows a continuous, dynamic process of cultural convergence and divergence, constantly shaped by the environment.
And it reinforces why relying on Egyptian sources alone is so misleading.
It is. When Egypt says Nubia is quiet, it doesn't mean nothing is happening. It often means the important action has moved too far south for the Egyptians to notice or control.
You mentioned Reisner earlier, and there's a specific example that really drives home how these Egyptocentric assumptions created entirely false histories in the South. Can we talk about the idea of the B group?
Yes, that's a great example of interpretive bias.
Yeah.
Reisner was a man who was, looking for continuity. With a powerful Egyptian Old Kingdom ended around 2200 BC, the A group culture, we'll get to them later, disappeared from Lower Nubia.
Okay.
Reisner found a layer of graves dating later, which he interpreted as a successor culture, the B group, and he claimed they represented an impoverished, less organized successor society reflecting Egypt's neglect.
So he saw them as less civilized just because they didn't have as many fancy Egyptian imports?
Exactly that.
Yeah.
He assumed that if there was indigenous life, it just had to be weaker than what came before. But later, more rigorous dating showed that the supposed B group graves were largely illusory.
Illusory how?
They weren't a new group at all. They were actually redated to the older, late A group period.
So the reality was that after the Egyptians destroyed those A group polities, the region didn't just get weaker. It experienced a massive settlement hiatus. The population either moved south or the territory was functionally empty of significant permanent settlements for centuries.
Precisely. The power center had definitively shifted south, and Reisner's desire for a neat, continuous chronological sequence that fit his Egyptian narrative led him to completely misinterpret the evidence. The truth is much more dramatic. Lower Nubia was abandoned, and the real action was now centered deep in Sudan.
Let's rewind the clock then. Way back to the deep past, starting around 10,000 BC. If we're trying to establish the antiquity of this autonomous Sudanic culture, we have to start here. And the environment we picture today is radically different from the climate that existed back then.
Radically different. The environmental history of the Sahara and the Nile Valley is a story of incredible extremes. As you said, around 18,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, the region was ultra-arid.
A tough place to live.
Incredibly tough. The Nile flow itself was dramatically reduced to maybe 10 or 20% of its modern volume. The Red Sea was narrower, It was a bleak, empty landscape.
But then the climate completely flipped.
It did. The Green Sahara phase began, the optimal wet period for the region. This peak occurred around 8,000 BP, before present, and the rainfall belts shifted an astounding 400 to 600 kilometers north of their present location.
400 to 600 kilometers, just try to imagine that transformation. Vast areas of northern Sudan and Chad, which are now sand dunes and rock, were covered by tropical grasslands and seasonal lakes.
And this fueled a massive population boom and migration. This moisture enabled the rapid repeopling of the region, mostly by populations moving north out of refugia further south.
And in the Middle Nile Valley itself.
In the valley, this wet phase meant an environment of high floods, extensive seasonal swamps, and braided river channels. This was particularly true in the massive fertile region known as the Gezira, the huge triangle of land between the Blue Nile and the White Nile. These conditions supported diverse, abundant fauna and, most importantly, reliable water.
This sounds like a perfect setting for stable, relatively affluent populations living off of this rich riverine ecosystem. And this brings us to that massive aha moment that forces historians to revise the whole traditional story of civilization, the surprising invention of pottery.
This is truly foundational to the deep history of Sudanic Africa. The discovery occurred almost by accident at Khartoum Hospital in 1944. An archaeologist named A.J. Arkell was working there and unearthed the type site of the early Khartoum culture. He identified what became known as the Khartoum Mesolithic, or visually the wavy line culture.
And the key insight here, the thing that just broke the mold of global archaeological interpretation.
That this was a relatively permanent settlement of pottery using hunter-gatherers.
Okay, say that again. Pottery using hunter-gatherers.
Exactly. They were subsistence fishers and collectors of wild resources. They were settled enough to manage large ceramic vessels, but they were not, by any definition, farmers. And this observation fundamentally challenged the assumption standard worldwide at the time that pottery technology was inextricably linked with the development of settled, sedentary agriculture.
So in the Sudanic world, the technological revolution pottery came before the economic revolution of farming by millennia.
By millennia. And this wavy line pottery is spectacular. It's often thick-walled, round-bottomed, and highly decorated with incised patterns. The wavy line pattern, which they made by rocking a fish spine or a comb along the wet clay, is the signature motif.
And it wasn't just a local thing.
Not at all. This culture's reach has macro-regional significance. This wavy line pottery, in its later variant, dotted wavy line pottery, spread across a massive 3,000-kilometer stretch of the Sahelian belt. It connected the Middle Nile to populations far to the west, towards Chad and Mali.
And the dating confirms it was a local indigenous innovation.
It does. Radiocarbon dating places the start of this tradition as early as the 10th millennium BP. It appears independently of pottery development in the Lower Nile or the Levant. It shows that the innovation came from within this great Sahelian corridor, driven by local needs and resource specialization.
So let's detail the life and technology of this Mesolithic population. If their lives weren't dominated by the plow, what dominated their days?
Their economy was specialized and centrally focused on the river. We find archaeological evidence of incredibly intensive fishing. Sites are just littered with fish bones and huge middens refuse heaps of shellfish. They particularly exploited large freshwater snails like palisaded.
And they weren't just eating them on the spot.
No. At sites like Shabona, archaeologists found what appeared to be designated storage pits full of these snail shells, suggesting they were a critical, perhaps seasonal resource that they were stockpiling.
To exploit those rich aquatic resources, they must have needed sophisticated gear, not just a simple line and hook.
Their technology reflects a deep understanding of the river environment. We find standardized, purpose-made tools, stone and ceramic net sinkers to weigh down fishing nets, and finely crafted barbed bone points, ideal for spears or harpoons.
So nets and harpoons, which strongly implies they were on the water.
It does. While preservation in the Nile mud is usually poor, the discovery of an early canoe in the Lake Chad region, dating to a similar period, certainly supports the idea that boats or rafts were essential to this riverine lifestyle.
Now, what about the grindstones? They're often found on these sites. If they weren't grinding domesticated grains, what were they grinding? This seems to be where the expectation of agriculture can lead you astray.
It's a crucial distinction. Grindstones are indeed abundant, but you have to look beyond grains. The evidence strongly suggests they were used for processing starchy wild foods, particularly tubers, which grew abundantly in the moist, seasonally flooded environment.
Can you give us a concrete example of this?
Well, the work done at late Paleolithic sites further north, like Wadi Kubanya in Upper Egypt, is highly instructive here. They found charred remains of over 20 different types of plant foods, including high-starch tubers of nutgrass.
And these tubers, they're not something you can just pick and eat.
Not at all. While they're nutritious, they are often highly fibrous or even mildly toxic in their raw state.
So the grindstones weren't for making flour, they were for detoxification and making food edible.
Exactly. Processing them, grinding, pounding, or steeping would have been essential to remove toxins or simply make them palatable and digestible. This shows a highly sophisticated knowledge of the local flora and complex preparation techniques that long predate the arrival of domesticated crops.
And finally, let's go back to the social impact of the pottery itself, just setting farming aside for a moment. Why was a ceramic pot such a game changer for these hunter-gatherers?
Well, the impact is profound, especially when you think about demography and health. Pottery allows food to be boiled.
Simple but revolutionary.
It is. Boiling dramatically improves health and survival rates. First, it kills bacteria and parasites so you can purify water or soften food that might be spoiling. Second, and this is perhaps most important for population growth, it allows for the preparation of soft, digestible weaning foods for infants.
Which means better nutrition and lower infant mortality.
Precisely. This capability would have greatly improved survival rates, potentially leading to population increase and stability even before the adoption of livestock.
And looking to the long term.
Well, that vessel wasn't just for boiling water. The ability to cook grains slowly and reliably was essential for preparing staple porridges and, crucially, for the preparation of fermented beverages.
You mean beer?
It's exactly. Grain beers. Beer became a major social staple throughout Sudanic Africa, used in feasts, rituals, and as a key dietary component. And that entire tradition begins with the invention of a stable ceramic vessel.
So the ceramic pot isn't just a container, it's a silent revolution in public health, demographic stability, and social ritual, all happening in the heart of Africa, completely independently of the Fertile Crescent.
Building directly out of that robust Mesolithic base, the Sudanic Neolithic followed a developmental trajectory that is, well, it's truly unique globally. We've established that pottery was already in widespread use, so the transition to the Neolithic wasn't defined by ceramics or sedentism.
Here, the key transformation was the introduction of new economic capital.
It was marked, first and foremost, by the appearance of domestic livestock. Cattle, sheep, and goats entered the region. We see them appearing in the central Middle Nile, the Dongola Reach, by the mid-5th millennium BC. This introduction immediately established animal herding and pastoralism as the central defining feature of the Sudanic Neolithic.
And this is already a major contrast with regions like the Near East or Egypt, where the Neolithic package usually features both domestic plants and animals arriving at the same time.
Absolutely. The unique sequence here is pastoralism first.
Yeah.
And the crops? Domesticated cereals like sorghum, which would become the staple crop of the region, came much, much later.
How much later?
Despite the millennia of sophisticated wild plant exploitation we just discussed, the earliest securely dated samples of domesticated sorghum are from the late 1st millennium BC. That's thousands of years after the cows arrived.
So for that crucial period between 5000 and 3000 BC, this culture was thriving primarily as sophisticated pastoralists, probably moving their cattle seasonally to maximize grazing land.
That's the consensus. And the route of introduction for this pastoral package is also fascinating. It's unlikely it was a simple, direct spread southward down the Nile from Egypt. No, the evidence, particularly the cultural links suggested by the dotted wavy line pottery, suggests that livestock may have arrived via a circuitous route from the west or northwest, possibly linked to pastoralists retreating from the increasing aridity in the central Saharan massifs. The Nile acted as a hydrological magnet, pulling these mobile populations toward its perennial water source.
The shift to pastoralism must have profoundly impacted social organization, and we can see this reflected most dramatically in how people express status, identity, and wealth.
Yes, there was an explosion of personalized material culture, and we see it primarily in burials. Because these groups may have been semi-mobile, their wealth wasn't necessarily fixed in permanent architecture, it was in their herds and on their bodies. The material culture suggests the profound importance of body modification and adornment as a status marker.
What specifically are we seeing in these burials? What kind of things?
We're seeing things like polished stone palettes. These weren't for makeup in the modern sense. They were used to grind and mix pigments, like red ochre and significantly green malachite.
Malachite. That's often associated with copper ore, which the Egyptians used as an eye pigment, but here the function seems broader.
Much broader. They have found evidence on human remains that bodies sometimes showed a distinct greenish coloring, particularly around the face and teeth. It suggests these minerals were used for deliberate, complex staining of the skin or face.
Which would have been a powerful social signal.
For sure. Marking identity, status, perhaps initiation. Beyond pigments, they adorn themselves with ivory armlets, necklaces made of hundreds of carnelian beads, and intriguing status markers like stone lip plugs and nose studs.
Stone lip plugs sound like a very specific regional marker.
They are. Intriguingly, these stone lip plugs appear to be much more common in the more southerly areas, particularly near Kadruka, and are rarer in the northern Dongola Reach. This signals significant regional variations in how status and identity were physically displayed.
Reinforcing that these were distinct Sudanic traditions, not just copies of what was happening up north. And crucially, these semi-mobile groups established massive formal cemeteries. Why did the dead become so important in a pastoralist landscape?
The cemetery sites like Kadero, Al-Gaba, and especially Kadruka, they became fixed markers of ancestral claims in a landscape that was otherwise occupied by mobile pastoralists. If your wealth walks on four legs, you need fixed points to assert territorial control and lineage. The dead provide that anchor.
How massive are we talking?
Kadruka features cemeteries containing well over 1,000 burials used continuously for centuries. They demonstrate a high degree of organization, often developing around a single, extremely rich central grave. At a site called KDK1, for instance, archaeologists found an exceptionally wealthy male burial.
What made that specific burial so rich?
The material goods were just staggering. He was buried with 9 complete mace heads, stone tools that symbolize power and authority, alongside numerous ivory bracelets, a large diorite palette, and significant amounts of the highly distinctive local pottery. These graves were often marked on the surface by unworked stone grave stelae, literally fixing the ancestral claim onto the territory for the whole community.
Clearly, this intense focus on death and ancestry was tied to the core wealth of the society, the cattle. How did cattle feature in the mortuary ritual?
The role of cattle went far beyond mere protein. They represented mobile wealth. They were crucial in structuring social encounters, determining bride wealth, and facilitating feasting and political alliances. Their symbolic significance is paramount in the mortuary practices. We find cattle bucrania, the skulls and horns, incorporated directly into graves or arranged around them.
But the practice goes further than just the skulls, right? You mentioned extremely elaborate animal sacrifice, particularly involving sheep.
Yes. This is a dramatic finding that demonstrates the immense ritual effort that was expended. Animals, typically sheep, were sometimes sacrificed and then elaborately decorated before being placed in the tombs. Archaeologists have found instances where these sacrificed sheep were adorned with complex woven beadwork and massive ostrich feather plumes attached to their horns.
It's amazing to picture that a sheep burial adorned with plumes and beads. It suggests a level of care and ritual significance usually reserved for human elite. What does that tell us about the symbolic value of livestock in this society?
It shows that livestock were treated as capital, not just food. By displaying or sacrificing that wealth, they were reinforcing the deceased's status, ensuring the prosperity of the lineage, and participating in rituals that strengthen social bonds. This kind of ritual sacrifice and display was a deeply ingrained Sudanic tradition that would carry forward and become even more spectacular into the later Kerma Bronze Age.
Now, let's pivot slightly north to the A group. They existed concurrently with the later stages of this Sudanic Neolithic down south, around 3800 to 3000 BC. This group often gets more airtime because of their Egyptian connections.
The A group was restricted to Lower Nubia, that frontier zone between the First and Second Cataracts. They were a crucial, though geographically peripheral, intermediary culture. Their material culture, specifically their distinct ceramics, like the finely made, ripple-burnished blackwares, shares clear features with pre-Kerma cultures further south, confirming their Sudanic cultural connection.
But their population center was minuscule compared to the massive scale of Kadruka or Kadero.
Vastly so. This is a key point to reinforce. While A-group sites are often rich in imported Egyptian material, wine jars, luxury pottery, stone vessels, their cemeteries typically contain fewer than 50 graves. They were completely dwarfed by the southern necropolises, which contained thousands of burials. This is strong archaeological proof that the center of political gravity and the core population were rooted far south of the Egyptian borderlands.
The A-group elite's power, therefore, stemmed entirely from their role as trade intermediaries.
Exactly. They gained status and wealth by brokering trade. They exchanged indigenous goods, ivory, high-quality skins, exotic hardwoods, and, crucially, gold access from the eastern desert for the luxury items pouring out of the newly unified Egyptian state.
But their proximity to this burgeoning Egyptian power was ultimately their undoing.
It was. Their trade dominance was short-lived. Their disappearance around 3000 BC is attributed directly to aggressive and hostile Egyptian military activity, specifically during Egypt's late pre-dynastic period, Dynasty 0. The expanding Egyptian state, seeking direct access to the gold and resource routes, systematically targeted and destroyed these small polities in Lower Nubia.
This wasn't just border skirmishing, this was military conquest aimed at market control.
It was. We have crude, rock-cut inscriptions found near the Second Cataract, like the famous depiction of the Scorpion King commemorating these early campaigns. The archaeological evidence shows a sharp drop in settlement density. The Egyptians succeeded in destroying the A-group trade intermediaries, leading to that settlement hiatus we mentioned earlier. The great centers of power were now indisputably located far upriver, beyond Egypt's immediate reach.
This brings us to the zenith of indigenous power in the Middle Nile, the rise of Kerma and the birth of Kush. By the mid-3rd millennium BC, this was not just a settlement, it was the earliest, large-scale, politically unified kingdom in sub-Saharan Africa.
Kerma established itself as the unquestioned capital, the center of the Kingdom of Kush. It controlled a massive stretch of the Nile Valley, around 700 kilometers of the river system. It represents the successful culmination of those earlier Neolithic traditions, centralizing wealth and ritual power.
And monumentality was absolutely central to demonstrating this power. Nothing defines Kerma like the Western Defufa. Let's spend some time on this structure.
The Defufa is truly awe-inspiring, especially considering its age and location. It is a massive block of sun-dried mud brick, standing approximately 18 meters high today, though it would have been taller originally. This colossal monument formed the undisputed focal point of the town's religious and administrative quarter, and it remained in continuous use for over a millennium.
18 meters of mud brick is monumental. How does that compare to contemporary Egyptian structures, and what was its likely function?
It is contemporaneous with the earliest great Egyptian pyramids, though built of very different materials. Functionally, it might be better compared to early Mesopotamian ziggurats, or maybe early mastaba tombs. It served as an elevated focal point for religious rites. Its massive size demonstrated organizational power and control over labor. It was built in layers, with clear evidence it was painted white, with red and blue bands of decoration. It was a beacon visible for miles, proclaiming the authority of the Kerma kings over the landscape.
And the urban scale of Kerma itself was substantial for the time. It covered the religious core and the sprawling city.
The main town site covered roughly 20 hectares, surrounded by fortifications, particularly in the later periods. The architecture was a dynamic mix, reflecting both indigenous traditions and evolving state needs. You had traditional circular wooden post-built houses, reflecting that deep Sudanic preference for round houses, juxtaposed with massive rectilinear mud brick structures used for administration, alongside huge storage silos and centralized workshops. And this urban core was completely dominated by the Great Defufa.
And the necropolis associated with Kerma is staggering. It rivals the scale of any ancient cemetery worldwide.
It is the single largest ancient necropolis of the Middle Nile, a testament to the longevity and stability of the kingdom. It covers some 90 hectares, and current conservative estimates suggest it contained at least 20,000 tombs, spanning 1,000 years of continuous, centralized use. The consistent use of this single sacred landscape speaks volumes about the political and ideological stability of the Kushite state.
Let's turn to Kerma's technological achievements, starting with its famously distinctive ceramics.
Kerma pottery is globally recognized not just for its distinctiveness, but for its astounding quality. The potters produced elaborate, incised black wares, but their absolute mastery is seen in the extraordinarily fine, polished, black-topped red wares.
Can you describe the black-topped redware? How did they achieve that two-tone effect?
They achieved it through a highly skilled firing process. The base of the pot was buried in organic material like wood ash or carbon during the final inverted firing stage. This cut off the oxygen supply to the top portion of the vessel, causing the clay there to turn a deep, lustrous black, while the lower portion, exposed to the air, remained a brilliant red.
And the quality was so high.
The pieces were so finely polished and so technically perfect that the skilled potters were able to replicate the forms and brilliance of metal vessels. It suggests they treated clay with the reverence usually reserved for bronze or gold.
And speaking of metal, how advanced was their bronze work? That requires significant resources and organization.
Kerma was highly advanced for its time and place. Bronze working began relatively early, in the late 3rd millennium BC, signaling an early mastery of metallurgy south of Egypt. And the evidence is solid. A well-preserved bronze working workshop was discovered right within the religious complex near the Defufa.
That location right next to the central religious building suggests the importance of metallurgy to the ruling class.
Absolutely. The products found include axes, daggers, and other tools. While the precise source of the copper ore is still being studied, perhaps from the eastern desert, this shows that Kerma was actively producing its own bronze tools and weaponry, maintaining technological independence rather than just relying on imports.
Their economy was stable, built on that dual foundation of agriculture and the older tradition of intensive pastoralism.
Yes. Evidence points to the cultivation of imported cereals like barley and wheat, though the indigenous staple, sorghum, seems to have been cultivated alongside them. But the backbone of the economy remained the extensive pastoralism. Anthropological studies of the human remains confirm this. The population often suffered from specific small bone injuries commonly associated with intensive handling and herding of large livestock. This secure and resource-rich environment, stable food production, plus mobile wealth in cattle, allowed the elite to consolidate immense power.
The true measure of Kerma's power, however, is not in its tools or architecture, but in the mortuary archaeology. The sheer escalating scale of death used to display royal hegemony, particularly in the later phases.
This is where the story becomes truly dramatic and reveals the absolute nature of Kushite authority. We can trace the development of mortuary display from the modest early Kerma burials to the colossal displays of the Middle and Classic phases, demonstrating an increasingly severe social hierarchy.
Let's start with the Middle Kerma period, around 2050, 1750 BC. What were those early elite tombs like?
They were covered with massive circular tumuli, earthen mounds, often 30 to 40 meters in diameter, huge labor investments. And this is where we see the beginning of the ritualized massive slaughter. The scale of animal sacrifice around these tumuli is just breathtaking.
Describe the visual effect of the animal sacrifice.
The Kushite elite would arrange hundreds of cattle skulls bucrania around the south side of a single tumulus, facing the tomb. These were not just random bones, they were carefully selected and arranged, sometimes up to 500 bucrania in one display. This signaled not just immense wealth, but the absolute control the ruler had over the lifeblood of the economy, the pastoral resources.
That is immense, but the display of power escalated even further during the classic Kerma phase, reaching an almost unimaginable climax.
The classic Kerma period, around 1750–1500 BC, represents the highest manifestation of this centralized absolute power. The royal tumuli from this period were gigantic, and the burial pits beneath them were horrifyingly impressive. Excavations have revealed clear evidence of mass human sacrifice.
Wait, 400 people? Was this voluntary or retainer sacrifice like we sometimes see speculated in early Egyptian graves? Or was this clearly coerced mass slaughter? What does the archaeology tell us about the speed and circumstances of these deaths?
The number is staggering. Up to 400 sacrificed individuals were placed in the tomb complex, lying alongside the royal burial. The archaeological evidence suggests these individuals, who included both men and women, were interred quickly, likely executed, and placed in the tomb immediately upon the death of the ruler. Whether they were retainers, slaves, or captives, the act demonstrated a new and absolute level of control and hierarchy within Kushite society. The power to command the lives and deaths of hundreds, simply to accompany the ruler into the afterlife.
That detail alone fundamentally reframes Kush. This level of power is truly autocratic and rivals anything we see in contemporary New Kingdom Egypt.
It forces us to recognize Kush as an internal African state capable of generating not just sophistication, but immense brutal power. And this growth of power coincided perfectly with a period of Egyptian weakness.
Let's discuss that dynamic. Kush as a genuine rival to Egypt.
During the Egyptian Middle Kingdom, Dynasty XII, roughly 1700 BC, the pharaohs saw Kush as a major threat. They launched extensive campaigns into Lower Nubia, known by the Egyptians as Wawat, Urtjet, and Setu, and built a formidable chain of massive mud brick forts.
And these weren't just police stations, they were immense military garrisons.
Correct. Forts like Buhen, Semna, and Askut were built primarily to secure the frontier at the Second Cataract. Their strategic purpose was twofold: control the movement of people and goods, and crucially control access to vital gold sources, like those accessed via Quban and the Wadi Laki route into the eastern desert. The garrisons in these forts were substantial and isolated.
So the forts drew a clear line separating the areas of limited C group settlement in the north from the true Kerma heartland further south. But the political situation changed dramatically during the Second Intermediate Period.
This is Kerma's high point. During the Second Intermediate Period, roughly 1750–1550 BC, Egypt was weak, politically fragmented, and partially occupied by the Hyksos in the north.
And Kush seized the opportunity.
They did. Under the classic Kerma kings, the kingdom grew incredibly powerful, moving aggressively north. They challenged Egyptian control, disrupted trade routes, and even penetrated Egypt itself, seizing control of the crucial gold mines and potentially extending their influence as far north as Thebes.
We have physical proof of this diplomatic and military challenge, don't we?
We do. We have sealings found at Kerma that attest to active relations, both hostile and potentially diplomatic, extending far north. And moreover, we have the famous historical text from the subsequent New Kingdom era describing how the pharaoh Kamose intercepted a letter from the king of Kush to the Hyksos rulers in the delta.
Proposing a joint attack on the fledgling Egyptian state.
Exactly. A coordinated military alliance against Egypt. Kerma was playing high-stakes international diplomacy.
Had that alliance fully matured, the history of the Bronze Age Nile Valley would look very, very different.
It certainly would. But ultimately, that formidable Bronze Age power was met by a unified and aggressive New Kingdom Egypt.
The New Kingdom, Dynasty Z, brought the power of Imperial Egypt back to the south.
Yes. The end of independent Kerma came around 1500 BC, crushed by the formidable campaigns of the 8th dynasty, specifically under pharaohs like Thutmose I and later Thutmose III. The Egyptians systematically destroyed the capital at Kerma. They pushed their southern frontier far beyond the Third Cataract, establishing claims of control as far south as Kyrgyz, beyond the Fourth Cataract.
This was a total conquest aimed at extraction, wasn't it? The Egyptians didn't just abandon the land, they occupied it and established a vast viceregal administration.
That's the critical distinction. This conquest marked the formal end of the independent Bronze Age kingdom of Kush, initiating 500 years of Egyptian occupation. Kerma was subdued, but the cultural traditions and the concepts of powerful Sudanic authority, including the memory of Kerma, were resilient. They did not disappear. They provided the cultural foundation for the later Kushite revival in the first millennium BC, known as the Napatan and Meroitic periods.
So the Egyptians might have conquered the land, but the distinctive Sudanic heritage endured, just waiting for the opportunity to reassert itself.
It did. And it's important to recognize that the eventual Kushite dynasty that ruled Egypt itself, the 25th dynasty, grew directly out of this long, powerful, independent history we've discussed.
It wasn't a foreign invasion in the same way the Hyksos were.
Not at all. It was the return of a deeply rooted Sudanic power to the north, reclaiming what they saw as their rightful inheritance, an inheritance predicated on the power structures established millennia earlier at places like Kerma.
So what does this entire rich, deep dive into the archaeology of Sudan truly consolidate for us, the listener? We started with the mission to move beyond the Egyptocentric narrative.
And the major finding, as synthesized by Edwards in the vast amount of modern archaeology, is irrefutable. Sudan and Nubia were never merely a buffer zone or a passive, weak recipient of Egyptian influence.
Not at all.
This region, the Middle Nile, generated its own complex, sophisticated, hierarchical, and technologically advanced cultures from deep time. We see this progression from the pottery-making hunter-gatherers of Khartoum through the cemetery-focused pastoralists of Gedruka, right up to the centralized royal and militaristic power of Kerma.
It was a history that followed an entirely independent developmental path from the Nile Delta.
And we can point to two defining characteristics of that independent path. First, the incredibly early indigenous invention of pottery, a technology developed by hunter-gatherers, which irrevocably decoupled pottery from the rise of agriculture, reversing the established global model.
Right.
And second, the development of state power based fundamentally on intensive pastoralism and demonstrated through those spectacular and often gruesome mortuary displays, culminating in the mass human sacrifice and bucrania arrangements seen at Kerma. These are fundamentally Sudanic traditions born out of the environment and social needs of the region.
The picture that emerges is one of a long, dynamic, and powerful African history that deserves to be appreciated in its own right, not merely as a reflection of its famous northern neighbor.
Absolutely. And that leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to consider as you process this history and look at maps of the ancient world.
Okay.
We discussed how chronological dating in Nubia and Kush relies heavily on correlating local finds with Egyptian artifacts, scarabs, pottery, statues. But these were sometimes imported centuries after their creation, meaning they were deliberately preserved or even looted from older Egyptian graves and reused.
That means a lot of Nubian events are anchored to the Egyptian calendar, even if the objects are unreliable markers.
It is a massive potential source of chronological bias. So this raises a crucial question about historical objectivity. How different, how much order, or how much more independent would our understanding of the Kingdom of Kush's timeline, its political evolution, and its cultural shifts be if we relied purely on indigenous sources of historical knowledge and consciously didn't allow Egypt's chronological framework, its calendar of dynasties and pharaohs, to structure and constrain the Nubian past? It encourages us to continually look for the internal dynamic, the purely Sudanic logic, rather than the external explanation.
A profound thought to end on, urging us to question the very structure of history itself. Thank you for guiding us through this incredibly rich and necessary deep dive into the Nubian past.
My pleasure. It is a history that truly deserves this level of detail.
And thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We hope this has equipped you with surprising facts and essential knowledge that will completely change how you view ancient Africa. Until next time, stay curious.